Today I'm back after a little over a year away, and we're going to kick things off with a few big changes. The first change is a change in location, and the biggest reason I've been gone for about a year. Last June I moved to Birmingham, and since then I've been adjusting to a new job, home, city, and marriage to my awesome wife Jess. It's taken me a bit, but after about a year, I feel like I'm finally organized enough, I feel like I can get out to the trails enough, kind of know my schedule well enough to get back to making videos. The second change is the focus of the video, and that change is my new bike. For nearly the last 2 years, the Hightower LT had been my trail companion. The Hightower LT was an incredible bike. So what could have made me want to switch? Well, back in April of last year, Pink Bike released a write-up on a new bike from a small brand in Cumberland, BC. The unique frame design and high pivot suspension caught my eye. After that release, I knew I wanted my next bike to be a high pivot suspension bike. But I also knew, at least for me, the Druid at that time was not something I could afford. The frame only price was pretty steep, and then you add into the cost of actually building up a bike around that, and there was just no way that that swap really made sense for me. Fast forward a little over a year later, Pink Bike released another article about Forbidden, this time showing that they had released complete builds of the Druid. Well, when I clicked on the article, I was surprised to find that they were a really reasonable price for the XT and SLX builds of the Druid. So, of course, the first step was to turn around and sell the Hightower LT. I sold the LT on Pink Bike after about a week and placed my order for the Druid. The bike shipped to my house built up much in the same way that you'd see most bikes shipped to the shop. I would say it was about 90% of the way complete, so not very difficult to put it together even if you haven't worked at a shop. Another nice touch is Forbidden included a digital shock pump and a small torque wrench set to help with the setup of the bike. Unfortunately, I did have to work kind of backwards once I first pulled it out of the box, because I decided to torture myself yet again and install an Invisiframe wrap on the bike. Other than the Invisiframe, swapped on a Deity Copperhead stem and then switched out the grips for some DMR Death grips. Past that, I've left everything pretty much completely stock with the build. After having about a month on the bike, I do intend to swap out some bits and pieces, but we'll talk about that a little later on in the video. I want to touch on first the biggest thing that drew me towards getting the Druid, and that of course is the high pivot suspension design that the bike uses.
It's likely the first thing that catches your eye when you look at the Druid. You have the high idler pulley adjacent to the highest pivot, routing the chain around an additional touch point.
If you're not familiar with the high pivot suspension design, you might wonder why this is even necessary or what the benefits may be. Well, when it comes to a traditional suspension design, when the rear shock compresses, the axle path generally moves forward. Some bikes have been able to design it where it'll move initially a little bit rearward, but inevitably that axle path is still going to move forward and shorten the wheelbase.
With a high pivot suspension design like the one on the Druid, as the bike encounters obstacles, the rear axle path is rearward, which means the suspension moves with obstacles as opposed to against them. This creates a smoother riding suspension that also lengthens the rear center as it compresses. This lengthening of the rear center also results in a more stable ride.
The downside to this drivetrain design is of course the added contact point of the high idler pulley. With this, you're going to have a higher chance for chain wear as you have more contact points, and it can lead to a little more noise and a small amount of drag added to the bike just with the extra touch point on it. This suspension design was my biggest draw to the Druid, but it wasn't the only thing that really caught my eye about the bike. Another key design feature of the Druid that drew me towards it was its geometry. Overall, the numbers are progressive, but not outlandish. For the XL size Druid that I got, it has a 485mm reach, which is about 20 mils longer than what was on the Hightower LT. The wheelbase comes in at 1263mm, and the rear chainstay length is 450mm. That rear chainstay length is the biggest number that I'm focusing on when I'm talking about the geometry of the Druid. What's unique about the Druid compared to a lot of other bikes is the rear chainstay actually grows size by size. If you think about the front center length on a small size bike versus that on an extra large bike, you're looking at a pretty big difference. So how can you expect both those sizes to ride as intended if the rear center doesn't change with those sizes? So obviously there are a lot of things I was excited about with the Druid. The high pivot design, the geometry, the frame's attention to detail and aesthetic. But how's it lived up to those expectations?
2 seconds later.
Overall, I've loved my first month on the Druid. I've ridden it here locally numerous times at Oak Mountain State Park and the JCC. I've taken it back to its roots at Chihuahua, and even made a trip out to Brevard to really put it through its paces. Through these rides in the first 30 days, I've started to get a pretty good feel for the Druid. First thing I noticed when I jumped on the Druid was how unique the high pivot suspension feels. This unique feeling definitely takes a little bit of getting used to. Anytime you go to compress to try and like pick it up, manual, bunny hop, anything along those lines, it's just a really odd sensation to feel the suspension lengthen and kind of push away from the back of the bike as you cycle through the suspension. This is really opposed to a normal feeling of the bike kind of compressing, but getting more compact as I push through the bottom bracket or through the back end of the bike. After about 3 days, I was able to get comfortable with it, and after some of the slight reconfiguration it took to figure out the body positioning and movement required to get the bike to really react the way I wanted it to, it feels every bit as poppy and playful at trail speed as a 130mm travel trail bike should. When it comes to traction and stability, the Druid's high pivot suspension has really lived up to its billing so far. It punches far above its 130mm travel weight class. It feels every bit as stable at speed as my Hightower LT did, if not a little bit more confident, particularly against those square edge hits and off big landings. I have noticed a few more bottom outs than I did on the LT, and that's just because you're looking about 20mm less on the rear suspension. I'd say the biggest weak point I've noticed in the Druid suspension is the small bump sensitivity. Previous bikes I've ridden have done a little better job on just taking the top end edge off of just smaller trail chatter as you're riding along. In Pisgah, which are the roughest trails I've taken it on, the Druid just continually pushed me to go faster and rewarded me by smoothing out trail even better as my speed increased. The Druid suspension design also has very high anti-squat numbers, which leads to a really good pedaling bike. Overall, the pedal bob with the bike is almost imperceivable when I ride it and when I look at someone else pedaling it. You really don't see the back end of the bike move much at all through any sort of pedal stroke in it. Like I mentioned before, I was really excited about the size-specific rear center of the Druid, and as such, it has the longest chainstay of any bike I've ever ridden, and overall, the bike is the biggest bike I've ever owned. Given those two things, it's impressive how balanced the Druid rides. Actually, after my first few rides on it, I measured it myself just to ensure that I got the XL sized bike, because there's no stickering on it that says what size it is. It was just riding so comfortably and so easy that I really expected a little bit more of a break-in period to get used to those bigger numbers on it. Focusing a little bit on the climbing of the bike, the seat tube angle lends itself to a really comfortable riding bike. It's not so steep that it feels cramped, but it's certainly not slack enough that I feel like I'm hanging off the back of the bike on any steeper climbs. I feel like the geometry plays really nicely with the pedal characteristics on the Druid, and it makes just for what I would call a comfortable climber. Where the Druid's handling has impressed me the most is in cornering and at high speeds. All my previous conventional wisdom would say that a shorter chainstay length means an easier bike to flick around and throw through corners. And to a degree, I still believe that. But when it comes at the cost of having a balanced feeling bike, I'm not so sure. My experiment with longer chainstay length for the Druid has so far been very successful. The Druid is the most comfortable bike I've cornered in flat ground or supported turns. My neutral riding position directly above the bottom bracket feels about perfect without many sweeping movements needed to really get my body position adjusted to push it through turns in the way that I would like to. Earlier I said I was planning on swapping out some bits and pieces, but we'll talk first a little bit about everything I intend to keep. For the fork, the Fox 36 Performance Elite model year 2021 has been great so far. Just like the one I had on my Hightower LT, it's got the Grip 2 damper, which I really like. There's plenty of adjustment to really get it dialed in the way you like. The Shimano XT 12-speed drivetrain has been pretty much flawless. I have absolutely no complaints with it. The range is good. The shifting is really smooth. But with that, I will say I haven't noticed a massive difference coming off the last few SRAM drivetrains I've ridden. So I think you get to that kind of level of stuff and they're all pretty dang good. I plan on keeping the XT4 piston brakes for a while, but I can't say I've been totally pleased with them. Overall, the stopping power, of course, is good, and I don't really mind the on-off feel, even though I'm coming from SRAM codes that definitely had a little bit more modulation. But my biggest pet peeve with these brakes is the change in the bite point, particularly in the front brake. On longer descents, the bite point changes multiple times throughout the descent. So one pull, it'll be about midway down the bar, which is where they usually are. And the next one, it'll be almost all the way out. And the next one will be way too far in. And this change just drives me insane. But if it wasn't for this changing bite point, I would be really pleased with the brakes. I wouldn't have any issues. So I'm gonna keep running them for a little while because for the most part, they are good. But Shimano, why does the bite point change? I see that this is a problem for a lot of people with these brakes. I don't feel like your XT level brakes should have this issue. Please fix it. Thank you. Moving over to the parts that I do intend to change. We'll start first with the DPX2 shock. Overall, I've liked the DPX2 shock pretty well. It's got decent adjustability. It's not too bad. It can feel a little bit shaky on repeated hits. I don't feel like it feels nearly as good as the X2 did for me in that regard. Overall though, I just think this bike would lend itself very well to a coil shock. It's less that I don't like the DPX2 and more that I think this bike would be awesome with the coil. So I am exploring options for a coil shock for the Druid. If you have any suggestions, let me know, but I've been looking mostly, of course, at the Fox DHX2, a little bit at the Push 11.6, the EXT Storia, but if there's any others I should check out, let me know. Last thing I'm looking to do is switch out the race face wheel set for some i9 Enduro 305s like I had on the LT. Those are wheels I just really like. They're wheels I trust. I rode them for a couple years and really almost never had to true them. Never got any major dents in them, and they just ride stiffer than the race face wheels do. The hubs on these ones are decent, so the DT350s, plenty of engagement, everything like that, but just overall the race face arc wheels, the rims on them, they're a little bit too malleable. I feel like they develop dents too easily, and I've already had to true them up a couple times, which is more than I ever had to do with the i9 305s. But as far as that's concerned, I probably plan to just ride the race face wheels until they blow up. And then we'll take a look at getting the 305s put on there. After about 30 days with the Druid, I can pretty easily say I'm really happy with my purchase to get this bike. It's been a dream bike for me since I first saw it come out, and I'd say so far it's lived up to its billing. There's still plenty more to learn about the bike, plenty more to see with it, and I do plan on doing a long-term review after I've had probably about 6 months on the bike to really give a better idea of how everything wears in. That'll wrap up all my initial impressions on the Forbidden Druid. Thanks for joining me back again after a year-long break. I plan to hit it again on the channel. My goal is to do like a bi-weekly posting schedule. We'll see how well I can keep to that between my 9 to 5 and other life obligations, but I definitely will be back more consistently than once every year. So go ahead and follow along if you want to keep up with everything that's going on there. If you have any suggestions for videos you think I should do, let me know down below as well. I'm working on a few already, but I'd love to hear from you. With that, I hope everyone's hitting the trail soon, and I'll see you guys in the next one.
Oh yeah.